Hey guys, what's up? This is Kerr. And in part 4 of Sculpting the Indominus Rex, I pretty much finished the entire sculpt in this video. I add all the scale detail, I remesh it, and I also pose the model. So go ahead, sit back, and enjoy part 4. Okay guys, so in this portion what I'm going to do is I'm going to use masking features to plot out the areas I want to pull out for scale detail. Now, I could have used an alpha for this process. However, I don't really like using alphas on areas that are a main focal point of where people look, because they tend to look patterned. Like, you can see repeating details a lot in certain alphas. So even though this process is extremely time consuming, I think the result is so much better and the quality of the model rings through loud and clear much more than you could get with using something like an alpha or any sort of stenciling process. So as you can see, I just go through and mask out all those areas, and the scales look so much better for it, in my opinion, because then you can go through and make specific patterns like I'm doing right here, like sculpting around the eye socket, getting specific scale patterns in certain areas. To me, that's a very crucial part in making a model look as good as it can possibly look. And there's a lot of sections throughout the sculpting process that I edited out of the video because it just would have made the video unnecessarily long. And this video is already going to run somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, so as it is. So I just decided, you know what, you guys get the idea good enough that I don't have to show the entire process, because it's just a lot of this, a lot of painting in masks and then going through and pulling out the detail from those masks. And for pulling out the detail, I used a Form Soft brush because I think I think it's a perfect brush for this type of work. In real time, adding in all the scales for the head took me somewhere around 3 hours. Now I am using an alpha in this area here because I'm adding a lot of like striations along the bony protrusions above the nasal cavity and the head ornaments, because that type of alpha you can kind of get away with because they're supposed to look kind of jagged. So that's one area where I did break my rule of not using alphas in high detail areas where people look a lot. And going through the arms here and adding some more muscle volume and a few of the skin wrinkles around areas that bend a lot around, like around the elbows. Adding in more volume around the base of the claw. Once again, using the clay buildup brush a lot in these areas. There I'm using the Damien Standard brush, which is a brush that kind of pinches as you pull in or pull out or push in detail. Now I'm adding these scales symmetrically, which, you know, for scale detail, it's not exactly the best, but at the later point in the model, I break the symmetry. I just want to get as much detail laid down as possible in a timely manner. So I was like, you know what, if I were to sculpt all these scales individually on both sides, I'd be here till doomsday. So I decided to just put them in symmetrically, and then I can go back through and break the symmetry where I feel is necessary. Now I use an alpha with scales for the body, because there you can kind of have more of a chaotic look of scales. So an alpha you can get away with in areas like that. But I try to stay away from them as long as I possibly can. You know, if you're watching this video and you're an aspiring, ZBrush sculptor, I really think this type of detailing process is quite necessary, especially when sculpting organic type models such as this. Don't rely entirely on alphas, because a trained eye can spot that immediately. And here you can see that I've remeshed the model using ZRemesher. It's a great feature in ZBrush that prevents you from having to go through and draw every quad out individually all over again. Now, it's not the perfect end-all solution. If you're going to animate this, you will have to go ahead and draw specific topology in certain areas, because even though the ZRemesher is fantastic and it gets you a good majority of the model, if you're going to use it for something like animation, there are specific areas you might need specific functions for. So, like I said, it's not the perfect end-all solution, but for my purposes, it worked out perfectly. And what I like to do is I like to project the detail one subdivision level at a time. So after you remesh it, you have to project all the detail from your other mesh onto the re-topologized mesh. And I just think it makes it easier on the model if you project one subdivision level at a time. And here I'm going through and I'm adding a pose to the model. It is not going to be the final pose that I end up going with, but I did want to kind of get an indication of the general direction I wanted to take the pose. And in retrospect, sculpting the hands in an already closed formation was not the best route to go. I should have sculpted them straight out to make the fingers easier to bend, but it all worked out. And I had to remesh it before posing it, because trying to pose a high polygon mesh is a nightmare. So getting a low polygon cage in there was essential for making it easier on myself to repose the model. And when you pose the model, you have to go back through and revisit a few areas. Some of your sculpt might become distorted, especially if you have a lot of high frequency detail in there. When you go through and pose the model, it can stretch out your detailing, and it can kind of mess things up. So after posing, sometimes resculpting some areas where you've articulated the model is necessary. Going through and adding in the rough texture of the inside of the mouth. This part was really fun, because you could go kind of chaotic with it. And I'm just using the clay buildup brush again to add a lot of veiny ridges to make it look as gnarly as possible. The scales on the lower jaw were quite a bit larger than the ones on the upper. And they definitely had a much more kind of triangulated look to them, if I say. Pointy edges. Not necessarily triangulated, but a lot more sharp edges to the scales than the ones on the upper jaw. Again, which is why I prefer not to use alphas, because you have much more precise controls over how you want each particular scale to look. Like I said, it's a very time-consuming process, but if you're patient enough with it, my goodness, the model just absolutely just says it's quality. I can certainly understand if you want to find a quicker solution to this type of detailing. To me, I've just grown comfortable with doing it this way. Going through and adding some like stretch marks to the membrane that connects the upper and lower jaw. I really wanted to make, this mouth is opening and closing constantly, so there would be a lot of, stress on this part of the body from opening and closing so often. So I wanted to really make it look like that. So I'm using an alpha here that has a lot of like slash marks in it, because that is a type of alpha that you do have a little bit more control over. Now the Indominus had like feathered quills running down its forearm, so I'm using Fibermesh for that. I could have, made, a polygon that looked like a long strip, but just for the heck of it, I just wanted to use Fibermesh for this part, just to vary up my techniques. Keeps it more fun and interesting that way. Now, if you're working in an actual production pipeline, you might have specific requirements that prevent you from being able to use Fibermesh, but I don't, so that's why I'm having some fun with it. Here I'm going through and I'm adding rough texture to the tongue. I used an alpha called Dragon Skin for this part here because it looked a lot like taste buds. So that's what I decided to go with for that. Because Dragon Skin is technically a scale alpha, but it worked in this instance for something like taste buds, so I was like, oh, why not? And that pretty much wraps up the sculpting phase, guys. I will be painting this model, so stay tuned for that. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me through this entire sculpting process, and you guys have a good one, and I will see you in the video on painting.